The Big Three battle: United Airlines vs. Delta Airlines vs. American Airlines. American Airlines, Delta Airlines and United Airlines are the three largest airlines in the US, and American and Delta are the two largest airlines globally. How have they risen to this position? The story of their growth is fascinating and, in a way, built on the remains of other failed airlines. Let's explore the growth, collaboration, and mergers that have brought us to the three major US airlines as we know them today. American Airlines began as a collaboration between several independent airlines. In 1930, many smaller airlines across the US came together to operate under a single brand, American Airways. As many as 80 airlines, including Southern Air Transport in Texas, Southern Air Fast Express on the West Coast, and Colonial Air Transport in New York, joined forces, mostly offering mail services. The passenger airline started to take shape in 1934 when American Airways was rebranded as American Airlines. The carrier introduced the DC-3 aircraft in 1936, having worked with Douglas to develop this larger version of the already operational DC-2. This version allowed for better passenger sleeper or seat capacity and longer range. The airline also worked with the mayor of New York to build LaGuardia Airport, and it opened the first airline lounge of any airline, the Admiral's Club at LaGuardia. After the Second World War, American started expanding services, focusing on international as well as transcontinental flights. It established a separate company, American Overseas Airline, in 1945, which began operating flights to Europe, but was sold to Pan American World Airways in 1950. It introduced the DC-7 for non-stop transcontinental services in 1953, a significant milestone. Entering the jet age in 1959, American introduced the Boeing 707. It had previously ordered the British de Havilland Comet, the first commercial jet aircraft, but cancelled these orders after problems with fatigue and pressurization surfaced. The airline has also grown through several acquisitions. In 1971, it acquired Trans-Caribbean Airways, and in 1990, it bought the London Heathrow operations of US rival Trans World Airlines. This was just the beginning, as American would go on to take over TWA altogether in 2001. American also took over part of rival Eastern Airlines. Eastern faced bankruptcy in 1991, and American acquired many of its routes to Latin America and the Caribbean. The events of 2001 hit the US aviation market hard, and the airline's financial difficulties were made worse by the financial crisis of 2008. The airline filed for bankruptcy protection in 2011. A major consolidation of the hard-hit aviation industry took place thereafter, and American acquired US Airways in February 2013. US Airways was the fifth largest in the country at the time. The merger created the largest airline globally at the time by several metrics, including revenue and fleet size. If you're liking this video so far, why not click subscribe and hit the like button? Oh, and be sure to click that notification bell too. Delta Airlines started its life as Huff Dayland Dusters Incorporated, an aerial crop dusting company founded in 1925 in Georgia. Purchased by keen businessman Collett E. Woolman, Delta Air Service was formed in December 1928, and passenger service began in 1929 between Dallas, Texas and Jackson, Mississippi. It then became Delta Air Corporation in 1930, but was already commonly known as Delta Airlines, although it was not formally changed to this until 1945. The expansion of its services continued throughout parts of the United States throughout the 1940s, but Delta made its first significant acquisition in 1953, taking over Chicago and Southern Airlines. This added the airline's first international routes to Caracas and Havana. Delta introduced the Douglas DC-8 in 1959 and was the first airline to operate the aircraft, as it was the DC-9 and later the MD-11. It modernized quickly, operating an all-jet aircraft fleet by 1970. The airline expanded with many new routes during the 1970s and 1980s, and in 1972 it merged with Northeast Airlines, a major Boston-based carrier founded in 1931. Acquisitions continued, and in 1987 it acquired Western Airlines, a California-based outfit with routes to the Caribbean and Alaska. One of Delta's larger acquisitions would be to take over most of Pan Am's European routes shortly before its bankruptcy. The Delta Museum notes that 23 new European and Asian destinations were added as part of the acquisition, while also adding 45 aircraft to its fleet. Delta boomed in the years after the Pan Am route acquisitions. In 1997, it became the first airline to carry 100 million passengers in a year. Like all airlines, though, Delta suffered in the early 2000s. Despite extensive restructuring, it sought bankruptcy protection in 2005, subsequently rejecting takeover bids from US Airways in 2006 and 2007. The restructured Delta Airlines emerged from bankruptcy protection in 2007 with a new logo and livery. It was not long after that Delta and Northwest Airlines announced a merger in April 2008. The merged airline received its single operating license in December 2009, with the Delta Airlines brand retained. The merger made sense as the two airlines complemented each other. It also received less objection than many other mergers. Northwest Airlines was strongest in the Midwest US, where Delta was weaker. Delta was stronger in the transatlantic and Latin American markets. Bringing the operations of the two airlines together took several years. It retained most aircraft but sold some regional jets to other airlines. It kept most of the hubs of both carriers but dropped Northwest's Memphis hub along with Cincinnati in order to streamline operations. And finally, we have United Airlines, which started around the same time as American and Delta but has a different origin. It was the only one of the three airlines to emerge as part of Boeing's early expansion. William Boeing founded the Boeing Company in 1916 as a manufacturer and supplier of aircraft to the military. After early success, the company moved into airmail and it set up a subsidiary airmail service, the United Aircraft Corp, in 1928. As aviation grew, laws and regulations shifted. The Airmail Act of 1934 prevented manufacturers and airlines from being part of the same company. This led to Boeing splitting off its airline operations to a new company, United Airlines. United's early services used the Boeing 247 and had hubs in Chicago and San Francisco. The airline's first merger came in 1961 when it joined with Washington-based Capital Airlines. This created the largest U.S. airline, knocking American Airlines out of top place at the time. The merger also brought some interesting fleet changes, as Capital Airlines was an operator of the British Vickers Viscount. United took on this fleet of 41 Viscounts, the only turboprop it operated. Entering the jet age, United was the only US airline to introduce the French Sud Aviation Caravelle. It did not operate the Boeing 707 like American Airlines had. United was the last of the three airlines to launch overseas routes, starting with Tokyo in 1983. Further expansion came with the downfall of Pan Am, acquiring its Pacific routes in 1985 and London services in 1991. In 1992, it began service on many of the Latin American and Caribbean routes. United and US Airways began working closely in the 1990s, sharing marketing and frequent flyer benefits. This led to an attempted acquisition by United in 2000, but this never happened. Similar to American and Delta, United suffered in the slowdown after 2001. This was compounded to a certain extent by the dot-com bubble and market decline. With its Western hubs, United was more exposed to this. It filed for bankruptcy protection in 2002, but continued operations. The restructuring saw a reduction in staff and fleet size, as well as the termination of several Latin American routes. Things got worse in 2003 with the SARS epidemic, with United again more exposed with its high proportion of Asian routes. It did not emerge from bankruptcy until 2006, the longest restructuring of any US airline. United's turn for a significant merger came in 2010 after having discussions with Continental Airlines as early as 2006. This made the new United the largest airline globally, at least until American's merger a few years later. The merger proceeded relatively smoothly. The new company retained the name, brand, and CEO from United Airlines, while its new livery combined the branding of both airlines. Following their mergers in the 2000s, each of the new airlines that emerged became some of the largest in the world. American Airlines, however, sealed the deal through its merger with US Airways. The combined airline became the largest in the US and globally by fleet size, passengers carried, and revenue. This title, though, has shifted around between the three carriers. In 2019, the blog The Point Sky reported that Delta and United had moved ahead by some metrics. In the second quarter of 2019, Delta had moved ahead in terms of total revenue. In terms of available seat miles, or ASMs, United led the way with a capacity of 73.2 billion ASMs. American retained and Delta followed with 72.3 billion and 71.8 billion respectively. American, though, has maintained top place for fleet size and passengers carried. Southwest Airlines has also risen to become a challenger to these top three. It, of course, lacks the global network and routes offered, but has grown rapidly in the domestic marketplace. By passengers carried, it has beaten United and taken third place since 2015. More recently, Simple Flying took a detailed look at how the three airlines had fared in the second quarter of 2020. All three airlines faced a significant net loss, but United came out best with $1.6 billion loss, while American posted a $2.1 billion net loss. The worst performer was Delta, with a loss of $5.7 billion. American fared best in terms of passenger revenue, reporting $1.1 billion from passenger bookings, while United saw $681 million and Delta $678 million. American was also the most active, significantly ahead in available seat miles, or ASMs. However, it wasn't the winner in terms of the passenger revenue per available seat mile (PRASM) metric. In fact, United led the way with PRASM of 7.6 cents per mile, while American was next with 6.48 cents per mile, and finally Delta achieved just 6.4 cents per mile. Going forward, of course, it's hard to predict how things will turn out. The future demand, especially for international flights, remains highly uncertain. Having the top cargo revenue could undoubtedly be useful for United, as demand remains strong there. But whatever happens, the big three airlines will likely remain the big three. 2020 has been challenging, but we've not yet heard any rumours of airline bankruptcies or mergers. There's been a lot to discuss with the history and evolution of the three biggest airlines in the world. We hope you've enjoyed this comparison and overview of their origins. When flying to or through the United States, which carrier would be your airline of choice? Let us know in the comments. Did you know that we publish over 175 stories every single week on simpleflying.com? Be sure to check the link in the description for more great stories just like this. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe before you go.